When most people think of the D-Day landings, we think of images like this. Massive German bunkers and machine guns and artillery crashing down on Allied troops over open beach, with only Czech hedgehogs and barbed wire for cover. In short, we portray the Normandy beach defenses as being nothing short of the perfect killing zones. So much so that watching movies like this, the casual viewer could well wonder how the Allies would ever win that battle at all. After all, it looks like suicide, how they show the boats just opening up basically right into the German muzzles. I mean, how could anyone win when you're going up against something like that? But, as is often the case with even the best of films, there are some troubles with this portrayal. Now, certainly the Germans would have wanted us to think of their defenses like this, but in reality they were less impressive, shall we say, than Herr Hitler would have liked. So in this video, brought to you by the Native Oak and sponsored by War Thunder, whom we'll hear more about later on, I want to first discuss the intention behind the vast defensive network collectively referred to as the Atlantic Wall, before then getting into its reality and why it may well have been doomed, like all of the Nazi mega-projects, from the very start. We'll begin then with our part the first, impregnable against every enemy, the intended Atlantic Wall. When Hitler declared war against the United States on 11 December 1941, cracks had already begun to show in his hitherto seemingly unstoppable war machine. Operation Barbarossa had ground to a halt in the east, and Britain remained resilient to the west. Still, the Fuhrer assured his people of the ultimate victory, due in no small part to the absolute security of all Western Europe to any Allied incursions. A belt of strong points and gigantic fortifications runs from Kirkenes in Norway to the Pyrenees, he declared in his war speech, and it was his unshakable decision to make that front impregnable against every enemy. He referred to the Atlantic Wall, a series of overlapping fortifications and strongpoints stretching from the border of Spain up over Denmark and thence along the whole of Norway. These works were to include some 15,000 heavy artillery positions, bunkers, pillboxes, and other structures, all supported by endless rows of barbed wire, trenches, tank traps, and obstacles, all defended by elite German troops ever watchful of invasion. There were to be tens of millions of mines planted on land and at sea, while reinforced U-boat pens and even rocket platforms would dot the coast. The intention would be to utterly annihilate any attempt at Allied invasion on the very beaches before they could ever dream of establishing themselves again on the European continent. On March 25, 1943, the Belfast Newsletter reported of one German war correspondent who claimed that the soldiers in the East may find comfort and courage in the knowledge that the Atlantic Wall is stronger than ever. Likewise, 1 year later, the same newspaper reported that the whole countryside has been remolded where the terrain was not suitable for the execution of the German plans. Mountains now stand where formerly plains used to stretch for hundreds of miles. In other coastal regions, mountains have been razed to the ground, and plains have taken their place. Of course, it wasn't all a consistent singular wall, but works were placed wherever they were deemed most necessary. Large portions of the Norwegian coast, for example, would have been totally unfit for any large-scale Allied invasions, and didn't need anywhere near so much fortification as, say, the northern coast of France. The works began as early as 1940. At first, they were intended to reinforce Germany's offensive capabilities during the planned invasion of England, Operation Sea Lion. As such, the initial work was primarily around the establishment of super heavy artillery in Calais and fortifying naval assets. But by 1941, the dream of Sea Lion was sufficiently delayed, if not outright cast aside, and the concept of a defensive Atlantic Wall as a massive, impenetrable barrier began to take shape. In constructing those barriers, the Germans employed something called the Regelbrau system, a standardized format for fortifications consisting of some 600 different structural patterns, all built using mass-produced, prefabricated materials wherever it was possible to speed up their production. Time, manpower, and resource management were easily the three most significant factors in attempting to construct such a massive series of works, but we'll touch on that later on. Whether it made sense or not, it was all deemed necessary because nobody really knew where or when the Allies might strike and in what force. In his 40th Fuhrer Directive, being a kind of executive order that superseded all the other laws and orders within the Third Reich, dated 23 March 1942, Hitler stressed that in the days to come the coasts of Europe will be seriously exposed to the danger of enemy landings. The enemy's choice of time and place for landing operations will not be based solely on strategic considerations. Reverses in other theaters of operations, obligations towards his allies, and political motives may prompt the enemy to arrive at decisions which would be unlikely to result from purely military deliberations. It would be vital, he stressed, to destroy the enemy as far off the coast as possible, and that all troops who might be exposed to surprise operations must always be fully prepared for defensive action. Counteracting the well-known tendency of the troops to relax their alertness as time goes on will be one of the most important command functions. That is spoken like a true corporal, and it's certainly very optimistic. And as we'll come to see in the next section, not only was the proposal to destroy the Allies off the coast a flawed one, it also came about resulting from severe logistical issues that had already made themselves well known by 1942. But of course, what are paltry logistics to the Aryan super race? Should even the worst and unlikely event occur that the Allies gained a beachhead against insurmountable odds, Der Fuhrer stressed that no headquarters and no unit may initiate a retrograde movement. There were to be no non-combatant men, but every German committed on or near the coast must be armed and trained for active combat. Fortified areas and strongpoints were to be held to the last and must never be forced to surrender because of a shortage of ammunition, of rations, or water. To ensure the maximum readiness of all the Western garrison forces, he specified that the niceties of peacetime protocol were to be foregone, and that all available local resources were to be governed solely by the necessity of countering every enemy raid with the utmost speed and force. All along the Atlantic Wall, civilian populations were liable for immediate evacuation should the necessity arise, while their property would effectively become forfeit to deconstruction or outright demolition. And all of that is to say nothing at all of the extreme applications of slave and forced labor in constructing the wall. Otherwise, most of Fuhrer Directive 40 was geared towards clarifying the precise command structures along the coastal sector, who would take command in the event of any incursion within a given area, and who was responsible for the construction of these ever greater and ever more expansive defenses. The picture being painted of the Atlantic Wall, then, wasn't just for the civilian population back at home, but for the military as well. It wasn't just meant as a purely propaganda tool. It really was made out and designed to be the last best hope for the Nazis to stop any invasion before it came and to prevent outright the dreaded two-front war. And as time went on, the intensity of that painting, that image, its intractable desperation even, would only ever increase. Thankfully, of course, we all know how well Der Fuhrer's art career ultimately went. Of course, while the plan may have been for an impregnable fortress Europa, it hardly worked out that way. German logistics all throughout the war were flawed, to put it very kindly, and the German High Command had a nasty habit of consistently underestimating both the material ability and moral willingness of the decadent Allies to carry on the fight. Perhaps they would have had a better job understanding just how extraordinary Allied military technology and logistics were, for example, if they had spent some time playing this video's sponsor, War Thunder. After all, War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game out there, and even the bankrupted Reich would have been able to play because it's totally free, not only on PC, but also consoles and even mobile devices. They would have been able to take command of over 2,500 different tanks, aeroplanes, ships, and even helicopters from 10 different nations, including the Allies, and even vehicles from their future. Which is to say, our present day, because the game has vehicles from the 1920s up until now, from biplanes to jets. The game also has an extraordinary X-ray damage view, so that you can see how the accurately designed armor reacts to the simulated ammunition that you hit it with, making sure to take careful aim at the points where your enemy is weakest. And you can imagine how incredibly helpful that kind of technology would have been to the doomed Germans, as they could have seen in real time just how ill-suited their war machine really was. Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble, I think. You know, the Tiger tank may have looked really cool, but it turns out having a functioning engine is a lot more important than just a bigger gun. Had the Germans been able to immerse themselves in War Thunder's incredibly realistic graphics and authentic sound effects, engaging with a worldwide player base of over 70 million in massive PvP battles, well, then they might have realized that a little bit sooner. Or maybe they would have thrown even more money into useless wonder weapon projects like the Mouse, which you can play as, by the by. I mean, who knows? You know, turns out an entire worldview based around palingenetic ultranationalism. I learned that term recently, I wanted to show it off. Turns out that isn't very pragmatic. Who'da thunk it? Not now, Edmund Burke. We're not here to discuss the pitfalls of revolutionism. This is a War Thunder ad. Instead, we'll talk about how the game has a way to play for everyone, from quick arcadey fun up to the highly realistic, slower-paced simulator mode. So whether you'll hop behind the wheel of a Leopard or take to the skies in a Spitfire, play the game for free today on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or even your phone by visiting the links in the description or the pinned comment below. And when you do so, for a limited time only, new and returning players that haven't played on PC or console for at least 6 months will get a massive bonus pack, including premium vehicles, the exclusive Eagle of Valor decorator, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account time. Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video, and now let us return to the topic at hand with our part the second. A dreary situation, German anxieties, and the reality of the Atlantic Wall. By the end of 1943, Germany's situation had grown dire. Their efforts in the east were collapsing. The Allies had invaded Italy and were on track to take Rome in a matter of months. And to the west, the Atlantic Wall was still only a shadow of its intended glory. Of the intended 15,000 overall defensive structures, only around 8,000 had been built. There were still massive stretches of land largely undefended, with immobilized and outdated tanks serving in the place of concrete pillboxes and bunkers. Shortages of equipment saw garrisons using captured French and other Allied weapons, while continual Allied bombing had wrought havoc not only on Germany's industrial capacity, but on the ability of their logistics network to supply the still hundreds of thousands of tons of steel and millions of tons of concrete necessary for construction, both of which incidentally were also suffering from severe shortages. Even had the roads been fully operational, shortages of trucks and even of horses meant that the further any one sector of the line went from the central supply depots, the less likely it was to ever be worked on at all. Likewise, many of the fighting troops had little to no transport at all, effectively becoming static defense troops when what Germany needed most was an ability to rapidly concentrate their forces at the point of Allied incursion. Those divisions were also severely undermanned, often relying on international volunteers and voluntold prisoners of war from the East to fill their ranks, which otherwise consisted of fresh and hardly trained recruits, typically men who were either too old or too young for effective service elsewhere. And to top it all off, they were even lacking in sufficient artillery and anti-tank weapons. General Rundstedt, the largely disgraced, at least in the eyes of Hitler he was, commander of the German army in the West, complained that the works were in reality nothing more than a propaganda wall, and that those few portions of it which were being completed properly were still rubbish and in a dreary situation. The defenses were all exceedingly thin. According to an article by the Warfare History Network, even the most heavily defended sectors of France were no more than 3 to 5 kilometers deep, meaning that should the Allies establish that initial beachhead, it wouldn't take much for them to break the line entirely. And regardless, even had the land defenses been perfectly designed and completed to their intended state, it was becoming increasingly clear that Germany's air power in the West was severely lacking, to put it kindly, while their sea presence was effectively non-existent, those atrociously massive U-boat pens notwithstanding. Yet despite all of the severe problems with the project, by 1943, construction efforts weren't speeding up, they were slowing down. Not only because of shortages in material, but even more so in shortages of manpower. In the early days, the Atlantic Wall was being constructed primarily by paid French laborers, free men, but the army was soon running short of them as increasing quantities of workers had to be pulled away for work on the interior. They were busy repairing infrastructure and production facilities damaged by Allied bombing, or attempting to expand mines and factories to meet the ever-increasing demand. According to the fantastic book The Business of Genocide by Michael Thad Allen, the crux of the war economy was not a material but a human resource, labor. Here, too, Germany had expected quick relief from lightning victory in the form of front soldiers returning to the factories. By the end of 1941, however, industry demanded 1 million additional workers just as the army announced new call-ups. An increasingly desperate search for any and all sources of labor ensued, and here the SS held desperately needed reserves. The concentration camps became the object of a last grasp for some inexhaustible supply of workers. This was far from the first such desperate grasp for a quick fix, however. In 1941, the German economy had turned to the millions of Soviet prisoners of war taken on the Eastern Front, but almost none arrived at German factories. The Atlantic Wall was no exception to this rule, and slave labor, notoriously ineffective though it was extensively employed in constructing the defenses. Many slaves were even being imported from other regimes, such as Republican prisoners of war from Francoist Spain. Civilian laborers were also forcefully being conscripted from all across the Nazi Empire, and even soldiers were ultimately being pulled away from their training and their preparations for the inevitable Allied invasion to instead work construction. The Atlantic Wall as a project demanded hundreds of thousands of workers, almost 500,000 Frenchmen alone, just in its immediate construction, to say nothing of all the ancillary work that needed to be done around it. And even without the war in the East, it would have been a massive strain on resources. In another Fuhrer Directive, number 51, issued in November of 1943, Hitler's desperation was becoming quite clear. I can no longer justify the further weakening of the West in favor of other theaters of war, he declared. I have therefore decided to strengthen the defenses in the West, particularly at places from which we shall launch our long-range war against England. Oh, who do you think you're kidding, Mr. Hitler? Only an all-out effort in the construction of fortifications, an unsurpassed effort that will enlist all available manpower and physical resources of Germany and the occupied areas, will be able to strengthen our defenses along the coasts within the short time that still appears to be left to us. He stressed in this order that while German gains in the East would permit their forces to retreat a significant amount without threatening Germany itself, that was not so in the West. If the enemy here succeeds in penetrating our defenses on a wide front, consequences of staggering proportions will follow within a short time. Yet despite this redoubling of effort, Germany lacked every means to see it through. It didn't have the manpower, regardless of how many slaves it brought in. It didn't have the resources, no matter how many regions it conquered, and it especially didn't have the time. By June of 1944, still the gaps in the line remained. Still the defenses were thin at best. Of the 15,000 intended defensive works, only some 11,000 had been built. Out of the 50 million mines that Rommel wanted to have laid, only 6.5 million were in place. He also wanted at least 6 rows of obstacles, Czech hedgehogs and the likes, to be laid all along the beach, but at most, they only ever had 3 layers. Likewise, the construction of larger concrete works by that point had all but ended, and been abandoned in favor of smaller pieces of more rudimentary defenses. Barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, and a million wooden poles being planted upright in the ground as anti-glider troop measures. They were nicknamed Rommel's asparagus, and looking at it, it's like, okay, sure, maybe it would have had a modicum of positive effect, but like, that's not going to be enough, and it seems like it would have taken a lot of man-hours to erect all those things up. For how much effect, I have to wonder. It's also worth noting here that these beaches were much, much larger than what we see in that Saving Private Ryan scene. So those defenses were nowhere near so well concentrated as to prevent free Allied movement, nor were the German machine guns anywhere near so close as to effectively dispatch the enemy before they could form up to commence their assaults. And then, not only were the defenses nowhere near dense enough to restrict a dedicated, concentrated assault, but their depth as well, which it was hoped would stretch inwards for at least 15 kilometers, it never really expanded in any meaningful way beyond those first few kilometers. Nor did the German transportation system ever sufficiently improve as to permit Hitler's dreamed of knockout counterattack to drive the Allies back into the sea, even if the men had been equipped and sufficiently up to the task to make it happen. They couldn't even be brought to the front in sufficient time and force. Instead, the majority of this utterly massive and yet thoroughly thin and, of course, completely static network, it went just unused. Millions of tons of metal and concrete and fuel, hundreds of millions, if not even more, of man-hours were all dedicated to this singular project that ultimately collapsed in a few hours. And Germany was hardly in a position to be sacrificing any of those resources to start with. Now, don't get me wrong. Overcoming the German defenses on D-Day was an extraordinary task still. It was a hard fight, and it required extraordinary levels of coordination and courage on the part of the Allied forces, to say absolutely nothing of their extraordinary efforts in preparation for it, both hindering the German industrial efforts, making sure that they couldn't get all that concrete and whatnot, and of course all of the efforts in misdirecting where the true assault was going to take place, and really encouraging the Germans to spread out those defenses. If the Allies had tried to land, for example, at Calais or any of the other ports that were turned into basically fortresses, well, they would have had a much harder time of things. But my point overall, right, is that German preparations and what they wanted the Atlantic Wall to look like and achieve was, in the classic Nazi style, very far from the reality on the ground. So much so, right, that as I discussed in my last video about D-Day, some of the largest problems that the Allies had were owing more to the natural difficulties of conducting such a massive beach landing, as well as their actually faster than anticipated advance, than it ever was owing to some German pillbox or bunker, no matter how thick its walls were constructed and no matter how many hours they put into their being erected. Instead, as usual, the Germans would probably have been much better served by focusing on flexibility, on their communications and logistics networks, alongside building heckin' more planes, training more pilots. Certainly would have fared far better for them than these big, flashy poster projects and war-winning wonders, right? To put it all very simply, right, in conclusion, and the main point of this video, the Atlantic Wall project was rather doomed from the start. Because even if it could be constructed to its desired complexity and its depth and density and all those things, right? Even if it was what they made it out to be, the impenetrable Western Wall and all that, the odds of it actually stopping an Allied invasion on the beach, and especially when the Allies had such overwhelming supremacy of air and sea and were free to choose where and when to attack and how many bombs to drop and how much preparation to have in advance. They were free to choose all those things, right? They had the time, whereas Germany didn't have the time. The odds of the Atlantic Wall ever stopping an invasion on the beach, like Hitler had always planned, I would argue were slim at best. A concentration, right, of force at any one given point of this long wall would effectively invalidate the works at every other point. That's the biggest advantage of the attacker over the defender in modern warfare. It's the ability to concentrate one's forces and strike where you will. And there's a reason why static defenses had largely been going out of fashion by that point for quite a while, save in very specific circumstances. So that by the end of the day, other than, maybe limiting some Allied commando raids and giving their U-boats a ridiculously secure place to operate from, the only really significant advantage that the Germans got from the Atlantic Wall, from all of this massive, empire-wide effort, right, involving resources and slaves and manpower and everything, and military efforts from all over the Nazi regime dedicated to this one project. For all of that, the benefit that they saw were a few bunkers and some obstacles on the Normandy beaches, defenses that were barely even a few kilometers deep. And those defenses were certainly very helpful on the day. They ruined the day of a good number of Allied soldiers. But, the benefit of those works, the proportionate effect that they had in fighting off the invasion, it was hardly equivalent to all of that effort, all of that logistical space, literally just physical logistical effort that it required. It was hardly, it was hardly even with what it consumed. As ever, it's that classic case, right, of amateurs with their tactics, the little corporal, compared to professionals and their logistics. So, in the end, I suppose the propaganda poster was right. 1943 certainly was not 1918. But 1944 sure was, and much worse besides. The lesson of World War I at the end of World War I, right, was that we had kind of moved beyond this whole idea of endless lines of fixed fortifications. Oh well. Thank you all for watching, and to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Remember that you can visit the links in the description or the pinned comment down below to play the game today on PC, console, or on mobile, all for free. And if you're new to the game, or if you haven't played on console or PC for the last 6 months, you'll also get a massive bonus pack for your re-enlistment across PC and console, which includes some premium vehicles. Of course, thanks are also owed to my supporters on Patreon, who, through their generosity, enable me to carry out all of my work. If you'd like to support this channel and get all of these videos ad-free, and often early to boot as well, well then you'll find the Patreon page linked below as well. And so, until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.